My daughter has been dead for 9 years. I know this because I identified her body. I signed the paperwork. I chose the casket, a simple one in pale oak, because she always said she hated things that were showy. I stood in the rain at Riverside Cemetery in Knoxville and watched them lower it into the ground while the minister said words I couldn't hear over the sound of my own heart breaking. I know she's dead. Except last Saturday morning, I saw her handwriting on a birthday card at a craft fair, and now I don't know anything at all. My daughter's name was Rebecca. We called her Becky from the time she could walk until she turned 14 and announced that she was going by her full name from that point on, because she was not, she said very seriously, a Becky. She was a Rebecca. I'd laughed so hard I cried. She'd tried to stay stern but couldn't hold it, and we'd ended up sitting at the kitchen table for 20 minutes just laughing at nothing. That was Rebecca. That was exactly who she was. She died on March 4th, 2016. She was 27 years old. A freight train derailed on the Clinchfield line in eastern Tennessee during a severe ice storm. 3 people were killed, including 2 passengers who were hitching an unauthorized ride in one of the freight cars, which was against regulations, which was exactly the kind of thing Rebecca would do because she was spontaneous and fearless, and she'd been trying to get home to surprise me for my birthday. The NTSB investigator who came to my door had the kind of flat, practiced voice that told me he'd delivered this kind of news before. Fatality, he said. Confirmed. I'm so sorry for your loss. I buried my daughter next to her mother, who had died 2 years earlier from complications of an illness that took her slowly and then all at once. I'd lost them both within 3 years. After that, I did what men my age do when everything falls apart. I kept moving. I went back to teaching woodshop at Jefferson High School for 4 more years until I retired. I drove my old Ford pickup to the cemetery every Sunday. I kept Rebecca's room the way she'd left it, with her books stacked on the windowsill and her half-finished watercolor paintings still clipped to the easel in the corner. I never threw away the birthday card she'd been coming home to give me. They found it in her jacket pocket, miraculously intact. I keep it in the top drawer of my nightstand. Happy birthday, Dad, it says on the outside, in that handwriting I would recognize in my sleep. The G's loop back on themselves in a very specific way, almost like a figure 8. Rebecca had taught herself calligraphy from a library book when she was 12, and that particular G had stuck with her for the rest of her life. It was hers, only hers. I'd never seen anyone else write the letter quite that way, until last Saturday. I go to the Marble Springs Craft Fair every October, not because I buy much of anything, but because it gets me out of the house, and one of the vendors sells a smoked apple butter that I can't find anywhere else. I was walking the 3rd row of tents when I stopped in front of a display of handmade greeting cards. The booth was decorated simply. White tablecloth, small bundles of dried lavender in mason jars, a wooden sign that read Lily's Paper and Pen in hand-lettered script. The cards were beautiful. Watercolor illustrations, pressed flowers, intricate designs. I wasn't really looking at the cards themselves. I was looking at the price tags. Each one had a small handwritten label with the price and a description, and the handwriting on those labels stopped me so completely that the man walking behind me bumped into my shoulder and had to step around me. Those G's, that exact loop, that precise figure 8 curve that I had stared at for 9 years in the top drawer of my nightstand. I stood there for what must have been a full minute just looking at the labels, my heart doing something strange and irregular in my chest. My hands had gone cold. The smoked apple butter bag I was carrying slipped from my fingers and hit the ground, and I didn't even look down. Can I help you find something? I looked up. The woman behind the table was perhaps 36 or 37 years old. Brown hair pulled back in a loose braid. Paint-stained fingers. She was wearing a flannel shirt over a white t-shirt, and she was looking at me with a polite, slightly concerned expression because I had been standing motionless in front of her booth, staring at price tags for an uncomfortable length of time. I couldn't speak. She had Rebecca's eyes. Not similar to Rebecca's eyes. Rebecca's eyes, that specific warm brown with the faint golden ring around the iris, the thing I used to tease her about when she was small, telling her she had sunsets in her eyes, which had embarrassed her terribly as a teenager. The same slight upturn at the outer corners. The same eyes I had looked into in a photograph every single day for 9 years. Sir? She was leaning forward slightly, more concerned now. Are you all right? I picked up the apple butter bag from the ground. I made myself breathe. I have been a high school teacher for 31 years, and I know how to control my expression when my insides are doing something catastrophic. I pointed at the nearest card, one with a watercolor illustration of a cardinal on a branch. Did you do the lettering on these yourself? My voice came out steadier than I deserved. I do everything myself, she said, and her voice was not Rebecca's voice. Lower, with a slightly different cadence, but it wasn't entirely unlike it either. The illustrations, the calligraphy, all of it. That G, I said before I could stop myself. I pointed to a price label, the way you write the letter G. Did you learn that from somewhere? A book? A class? She tilted her head, thrown off by the question. I don't know, honestly. I've always just written that way. It's a quirk, I guess. I managed to buy one of her cards, the cardinal one, and I gave her a 20 and told her to keep the change, and I walked away before my legs stopped working underneath me. I made it to a bench near the parking lot, and I sat there for a long time, staring at nothing, the October cold settling into my jacket. There is a thing that grief does to a person after enough years. It makes you hypervigilant in ways you don't even notice anymore. You see your lost person in strangers' profiles. In a particular way, someone holds their coffee cup. In a laugh that comes through a restaurant wall. You know rationally that it isn't them. And after 9 years, I knew how to talk myself back from that ledge. I had done it dozens of times. But this was not a profile. This was not a laugh. This was a physical characteristic so specific that I had never seen it on another living person in 63 years of life. I sat on that bench until the fair started closing down around me. And then I drove home to my empty house, and I stood in the kitchen, and I did not know what to do. I went to my nightstand and I took out the birthday card. I laid it flat on the kitchen table. I went back to my coat pocket, and I took out the card I'd bought at the fair, the cardinal card, and I laid it next to the birthday card. There was no handwriting on the cardinal card itself, but the price label was still stuck to the back. I looked at them side by side. The birthday card in Rebecca's hand from 9 years ago. The price label in the hand of a woman named Lily. My vision blurred. I had to sit down on the kitchen floor because my legs finally gave out, and I sat there with my back against the cabinet where Rebecca used to sit when she was a toddler while her mother cooked, banging a wooden spoon on the floor like it was a drum. I did not sleep that night. I went to the craft fair website on my laptop at 2 a.m. and found the vendor list, and found Lily's paper and pen, and found a contact email address. I stared at the email compose window for an hour before I finally typed something. I introduced myself. I told her I'd bought a card at her booth that afternoon. I said I knew this might sound strange, but I would very much like to speak with her again, if she was open to it. I left my phone number and I hit send and I closed the laptop, and I went and sat in Rebecca's room in the chair by the window until the sun came up. She called at 9:47 the next morning. Mr. Cole? Her voice was careful, like she was approaching something unfamiliar. This is Lily Harper. You emailed me? Yes. Thank you for calling. I cleared my throat. I'm sorry to have been strange about it at the fair. I'd like to explain, if you'll let me. A pause. Okay. I told her about Rebecca. I told her about the handwriting. I told her about the birthday card in my nightstand. I spoke slowly, trying to sound like a reasonable person rather than a grieving old man grasping at impossible things. She was quiet for a long time after I finished. I'm very sorry about your daughter, she said finally. I'm sure it must be painful to see reminders of her in unexpected places. I know how it sounds. I'm not sure what you're asking of me. I'm not sure either, I said honestly. Would you be willing to meet with me, just for coffee? So I can apologize properly for making you uncomfortable and maybe show you what I'm talking about. She said yes. She agreed to meet me the following Thursday at a coffee shop in downtown Knoxville called the Bright Cup. She said she drove down to Knoxville occasionally anyway. She lived in Asheville, North Carolina, about 2 hours east. She said she would think of it as a day trip and not to worry about imposing. I spent the days between that phone call and Thursday in a state that I can only describe as suspended animation. I didn't trust what I was feeling. I'd been through enough loss to know that the mind will construct elaborate and persuasive stories when it wants something badly enough. I had wanted Rebecca back for 9 years. That kind of want can make a man see things that aren't there. But the handwriting? I brought two things to the Bright Cup on Thursday. I brought the birthday card from my nightstand. And I brought my phone, loaded with photographs. She was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with a cup of something and her hands wrapped around it, and she stood when she saw me, and we shook hands. Closer than the craft fair, in the better light of the coffee shop, I had to work very hard to keep my face composed. I ordered coffee I didn't taste, and I sat across from her and I put the birthday card on the table between us. "My daughter wrote this," I said. "She was bringing it home to give me for my birthday. It was found in her jacket pocket at the accident site." Lily looked at the card without touching it. "The way she forms her G's," I said quietly. I watched her face change. She reached out and touched the edge of the card gently, and then she looked at her own hand, and I could see her tracing the shape of the letter in the air with her fingertip without seeming to realize she was doing it. "I don't know what to say," she said. "Neither do I. I'm not here to upset you. I'm not here to tell you something impossible is true. I just need you to understand why I couldn't let it go." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I don't remember most of my life before about 2017. I know that probably sounds like something a person makes up, but it's true. I had an accident. I was in the hospital for a long time, and when I came out of it, most of what came before was just gone." My coffee cup clicked against the saucer. My hands were not steady. "What kind of accident?" I asked. "I don't know exactly. I was told it was a fall. I was found alone, and there was no identification on me. The hospital in Mitchell County, that's in western North Carolina, treated me for several months. By the time I was well enough to start asking questions, nobody had come looking for me. A social worker helped me file the paperwork for a new identity. I chose the name Lily because I'd always liked lilies and I had to choose something. Mitchell County, western North Carolina. The Clinchfield rail line ran through western North Carolina before it crossed into eastern Tennessee. I knew this because I had spent weeks after Rebecca's death studying every detail of the route she'd been on. "What year?" I managed to say. "When did you wake up in that hospital?" She thought about it. Summer of 2016. June, I think. They estimated my age at around 27 based on bone density, so I would have been born around 1989. Rebecca was born on September 14th, 1988, 27 in the spring of 2016. Close enough that a rough hospital estimate from bone density could account for the difference. I picked up my phone. I found a photograph I had chosen specifically for this. It was from a Christmas 4 years before the accident. Rebecca at the kitchen table, laughing at something off camera, her hair loose, wearing a dark green sweater, completely unguarded and completely herself. I had chosen it because she was not looking at the camera. I did not want to ambush this woman with a portrait. I turned the phone toward Lily slowly. She looked at the photograph. Then she looked at me. Then she looked at the photograph again. "Who is she?" Her voice was very quiet. "That's Rebecca," I said. "That's my daughter. That's who I think you might be." She stood up from the table so abruptly that her coffee sloshed over the rim of the cup. She walked toward the window and stood there with her back to me, and I could see her shoulders moving. I did not follow her. I sat there and let her have whatever moment she was having. The coffee shop was busy enough that no one paid us any particular attention. After maybe 5 minutes, she came back to the table and sat down. Her eyes were red. "I don't remember that face," she said. "I look at that photo and I feel something, but I can't tell you that I remember her." A pause. "I can't tell you I remember anything." "I know. You'd want a DNA test." "Yes, if you're willing. And if it comes back that I'm not your daughter?" I looked at my coffee cup. "Then I'll apologize for wasting your time, and I'll go back to my Sunday visits to the cemetery, and I'll find a way to make peace with the fact that it was just a coincidence. A coincidence that I genuinely cannot explain. But a coincidence." She nodded once. "Set it up," she said. "Whatever you need." I drove home to Knoxville alone that evening. The mountain roads were dark and the sky was very clear, and I talked out loud to my wife the whole way home, the way I used to talk to her at the kitchen table about whatever was on my mind. I told her what had happened. I told her I was probably a foolish old man who had seen what he wanted to see. I told her that if there was any chance at all, I needed her to know I was not going to look away from it. The road was long and very quiet, and the stars were the kind of brilliant you only get in October at elevation. I contacted a private investigator the next day. His name was Dennis Hartley, a retired Knox County Sheriff's deputy who did this kind of work now. I'd gotten his name from a friend. I told him what I'd told no one else yet, because saying it out loud to another person made it real in a way I wasn't sure I could survive if it turned out to be nothing. He listened without interrupting, which I appreciated. He told me he'd start with the accident reports. The DNA test results wouldn't come back for 2 weeks. Dennis called me before they did. What he'd found made me sit down on the porch steps in the middle of the afternoon in a daze while the neighbors drove by going about their perfectly normal lives. There had been 2 people on that freight car the night of the derailment. Rebecca, who had been traveling to surprise me, and another young woman named Paige Dunmore, 24 years old, from Roanoke, Virginia, who had also been hitching a ride for reasons that were never fully established. Both women had been thrown from the car during the derailment. The crash site was chaotic. The ice storm was severe. The stretch of track ran through a remote gorge with limited access. Rebecca had been found approximately 40 feet from the wreckage. Paige Dunmore had been found further down the slope, closer to the tree line. The identification had been made based on a small gold locket found near one of the bodies. I had given Rebecca a gold locket for her 21st birthday. Her name was engraved on the back. It contained a photograph of her mother. When the first responders found that locket in the snow near one of the injured women, the assumption had been reasonable but wrong. The locket had come off during the impact. No one had verified which body it was closest to before the scene was disturbed by the extraction efforts. The body identified as Rebecca's had multiple injuries consistent with a severe fall. No fingerprints were taken because the identification had been considered confirmed through the locket and the corroboration that she had been a known passenger. I had identified the body visually, but the injuries had been significant, and I had been in shock, and I had confirmed what I had been told to expect to see. The medical examiner had not had reason to pursue further verification. Paige Dunmore's family was from Virginia. Her estrangement from them was documented. She had been reported missing, but the missing person case had been filed in a different jurisdiction and had not been cross-referenced with the Tennessee fatality report. Rebecca had survived the fall. She had been found by a couple who lived on a rural property at the base of the gorge, an older man and his wife, who had seen the emergency lights from their back field. By the time they found her, the main rescue operation at the crash site had been completed, and the weather was worsening. They'd driven her themselves to the nearest hospital, which was in Mitchell County, North Carolina, on the other side of the state line, because the roads back toward Tennessee were already closing. She had been admitted as a Jane Doe with severe head trauma, a fractured pelvis, and 3 broken ribs. She had been in a medically induced coma for 11 weeks. When she woke up in June of 2016, she did not know her name. In Tennessee, her family, meaning me, had already buried someone else in her place. Dennis laid all of this out for me in my kitchen over 2 hours. His notes spread on the table, and I sat there and let it happen to me, the way a man lets a flood happen, not because you choose to, but because there is simply no other option available to you. The Mitchell County Hospital records confirm the admission date and the Jane Doe status, Dennis said. I've already spoken with the attending physician who's still practicing. He remembers the case. He said she was one of the most severe head trauma patients he'd seen survive. He said the memory loss was total and expected given the nature of the injury. He said he was not surprised that no one found her because, by the time she was coherent enough to be identified, she had no information to give. Why didn't anyone come looking? My voice was someone else's voice. They did, Dennis said, but they were looking for Rebecca Cole, who was officially deceased. There was no open missing person case to match against. The Jane Doe records were filed in North Carolina. The fatality report was in Tennessee. Different states, different systems, no automatic cross-referencing. It fell through every gap there was to fall through. I pressed my hands flat on the kitchen table. She's been 2 hours away for 9 years. Dennis didn't say anything to that. The DNA results came back 4 days later. 99.8% probability of a parent-child biological relationship. The genetic counselor read the number to me over the phone in a careful and gentle voice. And I thanked her and ended the call and walked out to my backyard and stood in the cold November morning and looked at the old apple tree that Rebecca had climbed every summer as a child until she was too old to do it without feeling self-conscious, at which point she had started doing it again on principle. I called Lily. It rang 4 times and I was afraid she wasn't going to answer, and then she did. The test came back, I said. A long silence. Lily, I said. And the name felt strange in my mouth because it was not her name. It was a name she had given herself when she needed one. The test says, "You're my daughter." I heard her breathing. "Okay," she said finally. Very soft. Just that one word. "I know you don't remember," I said. "I need you to know that doesn't matter to me. Not the way you might think it does. You're alive. You've been alive. That's 9 years of something I thought was impossible. I don't need the memories, I just need you." She was crying. I could hear it. "I don't know how to be your daughter," she said. "You don't have to know. We'll figure out what it is. Something new, whatever it turns out to be." She came to Knoxville 2 weeks later. I stood in the driveway and watched her blue hatchback turn in and park. And when she got out, I was struck again, as I had been every time I saw her, by the absolute irreducible fact of her face. The same face. Older, weathered slightly, with the small lines around the eyes and mouth that came from 9 years, lived without knowing who she was. But the same face. We didn't hug in the driveway. We weren't there yet. She stood by her car and I stood by the porch steps, and we looked at each other for a moment, and then I said, "Come inside. I'll make coffee." She followed me into the house. I watched her look around the living room the way I had expected she might, with the careful attention of a person cataloging an unfamiliar space. The bookshelves, the fireplace, the framed photographs on the wall. She stopped in front of one of those photographs for a long moment. It was a family photo from a beach vacation, Rebecca and her mother and me, all 3 of us squinting into the sun, all 3 of us laughing at something. Rebecca had been 19. "The woman in the middle," she said. "Who is she?" "Your mother?" I said. Her name was Carol. Something moved across her face that I couldn't read. "She's beautiful." "Yes," I said. She was. We sat at the kitchen table with our coffee, and I answered every question she could think to ask. I told her about her childhood, the same way I might describe someone to a stranger who had never met them. I kept my voice steady. I was careful not to ask anything of her in the telling, not to search her face for flickers of recognition I could then cling to. I had made a private decision in the days before her visit that I would give her information freely and hold my need at arm's length, because she deserved to make her own account of this without the weight of my wanting pressing on every moment. She asked about her mother's illness. She asked what subjects she had studied in school. She asked what she had been like as a teenager. I told her she had been Genwisensof, between 15 and 17, opinionated and stubborn and occasionally breathtakingly rude, and that I had loved her ferociously throughout. She almost smiled. "And the watercolors," she said. "The ones on the easel upstairs. Those are mine? Half finished when you left for the trip. I never moved them." She was quiet. Then, "I've been painting for about 5 years. I just picked it up. I don't know why. It felt like something I already knew how to do." After an hour, she asked if she could look around the house. I said of course, and I stayed in the kitchen, so she could do it on her own. I listened to her footsteps moving overhead, slow and deliberate, the way you walk in a museum. They stopped for a long time in what I knew was her bedroom. She came back downstairs after 20 minutes. She stood in the kitchen doorway. "There's a bookshelf in that room," she said. "Architecture books. And a red book at the end of the second shelf, a novel. I don't know the title, but I know how it ends." She paused. "I know the ending before I've ever read it." "You read it 4 times, I said. "You told me once it was the only book that had ever made you feel like the ending was exactly right." She came the rest of the way into the kitchen and she sat back down at the table and she put her face in her hands. I gave her a moment. Then I said, "There's something I'd like you to try, if you're willing." I went to the cabinet and found the index card where I'd written down my wife's peach cobbler recipe, the one she'd made from memory every summer, the one I had attempted twice after she died with middling results. I laid it on the table. "This was your mother's recipe," I said. "She made it every August when the peaches came in. You used to help her make it from the time you could reach the counter. Lily looked at the card. She read it over. Then she set it down, and she looked at the peaches I'd put in the bowl on the counter, and something happened in her eyes. A shift, something beneath the uncertainty. That's wrong, she said, pointing at the card. The second step, you're supposed to let them macerate longer than that, and she didn't use nutmeg. Just cinnamon and a little cardamom. She stopped. How do I know that? Because you made it with her, I said. Every August for as long as I can remember. Carol always said you made it better than she did by the time you were in high school. She looked at the peaches for a long time. Can we make it? She asked. Right now? We made the cobbler together in that yellow kitchen on a November afternoon, which was not the season for it and required peaches I'd bought canned, which was a compromise we both agreed on. She worked without the recipe card, or rather, she looked at it once and then pushed it aside. Her hands knew the process. She let the fruit sit longer than the card said to. She added the cardamom. She crimped the edges of the biscuit dough in a way that I recognized from 30 years of watching Carol do the same thing at the same counter. We didn't talk much while we worked. There didn't seem to be anything that needed saying. The oven was warm and the kitchen smelled like it used to smell, and I stood at my side of the counter and I did not look at her too much because I didn't want to make her feel like a thing I was examining. She was not a thing. She was my daughter standing in her mother's kitchen, making her mother's recipe without knowing she remembered it. We ate it at the kitchen table as it got dark outside. It needs real peaches, she said. Come back in August, I said. There's a farm stand on Route 11 that sells them by the bushel. She looked at me across the table. You want me to come back? I want you to come as many times as you want to, for as long as you want to. I'm not going to pretend there's nothing here that I need, because that would be a lie, and I've been trying very hard not to lie about things since Carol died. But what I need is not the point. You get to decide what this is. She wrapped her hands around her bowl. I don't know what I'm deciding. You have time. There's no rush. You really kept paying her phone bill all these years? I nodded. Why? I thought about how to answer that. Because turning it off felt like saying it was final, and I wasn't ready to say that. I paused. I'm still paying it. I know that doesn't make practical sense. Something in her face went soft. I think that's the least crazy thing you've told me today, she said. We went to the cemetery before she drove back to Asheville. It was nearly 7 in the evening, fully dark, and I wasn't sure it was appropriate to ask it of her, but she was the one who asked to go. We stood in front of Carol's grave first. A simple gray stone. Carol Ann Cole, beloved wife and mother. Lily stood very still with her hands in her coat pockets, and didn't say anything for a long time. I wish I could remember her voice, she said. She hummed, I said, constantly, while she cooked, while she drove, while she was reading. Not any particular song, just whatever was in her head. It used to drive me crazy. After she died, the silence in the car was the hardest part. She didn't respond to that, but she stayed by the stone for another minute before we moved to the grave next to it. The headstone read Rebecca Ann Cole. The dates were wrong. Not wrong because the stonemason had made an error, but wrong because she was standing next to me in the dark, alive and real, in a coat she'd bought herself in Asheville for a name that wasn't hers. That's me, she said. It was not a question. That's where I thought you were. She reached out and touched the cold stone with her fingertips. Marcus Webb, she said. That was his name. The other victim who was with you in the original story. I blinked. I'm sorry? She looked at me. I don't know why I said that. I meant the other person. The one who was buried there instead of me. Paige. Her name was Paige. Paige Dunmore, I said. Lily dropped her hand from the stone. What happens to her now? Dennis has been trying to locate her family. She has a sister in Virginia who has been told the news. It's complicated and painful for them too, in a different way. We're working through the legal side of it. I paused. Paige deserves to have her name back. We're going to fix the record. She nodded slowly. She was somebody's daughter too. Yes, she was. We stood there for another few minutes in the dark, and the cold father and daughter at the grave that had held her name for 9 years. And I did not try to fill the silence with anything, because some silences are not meant to be filled. The months that followed were not simple. Nothing about a thing like this is simple. There were lawyers. and there were medical records to obtain and court filings to make, and a careful, painstaking process to officially restore Rebecca's identity while also honoring Paige Dunmore's. Lily, my daughter, kept the name for a long time. She said Rebecca felt like someone she was still getting to know. I told her it didn't matter what she called herself. I would answer to whatever she needed me to be. She continued to live in Asheville and continued to make her cards, and she came to Knoxville about once a month through the winter. Each visit was a little different. She was not a person who had come home and remembered. She was a person who was learning home for the first time as an adult, the way you might learn a new language that contains the faint echo of something ancient in it that you can't quite name. She would pick up an object and hold it, and sometimes a small specific thing would surface. Not a full memory, but a fragment, an impression, the weight of a particular ceramic mug, the sound the third step made on the staircase, the way the afternoon light came through the kitchen window in winter. She went to a therapist who specialized in this kind of work. She told me after her third appointment that the doctor had said her type of amnesia was likely permanent at its core, but that implicit memories, the procedural and emotional kind, often persisted in ways that explicit recall did not. She said the doctor called it knowing without remembering. She said she thought that was a reasonable description of how she felt about me. I took that, and it was enough, and it was more than I had thought possible. In February, she asked if I would teach her to use a woodworking lathe. She'd seen my workshop and expressed interest, and I'd offered, and then she had thought about it for 3 weeks before accepting. We spent a Saturday afternoon in the workshop, and she took to it with a fluency that surprised her and did not surprise me at all, because she had grown up watching me work in that same workshop, and her hands had learned some of what I knew the same way they had learned the cobbler recipe. By the end of the afternoon, she had turned a small bowl out of cherry wood, and she held it and looked at it and said that she felt like she had done this before. "You have," I said. "You used to sit on that stool over there and hand me tools when you were 4 years old." She set the cherry wood bowl on the workbench very carefully. "Dad," she said, "just trying it out, just seeing how it felt in her mouth." I put down the tool I was holding. "Yeah," I said. My voice was not quite right, but I made it work. "That's me." She didn't say anything else, and I didn't need her to. We turned back to the workbench, and she showed me how she'd done the curved interior of the bowl, and I told her there was a technique for cleaning up that particular edge, and I demonstrated it, and she watched with her arms crossed and her head tilted the way she had always tilted it when she was paying close attention, and the workshop was warm, and the wood shavings smelled the way they had always smelled, clean and sharp and permanent, and my daughter was alive and standing next to me, and that was everything. Paige Dunmore was formally re-identified through DNA in March. Her sister, a woman named Gretchen, drove down from Virginia to handle the arrangements. I met her once, briefly, in an attorney's office. She was a quiet woman in her early 40s with Paige's coloring, and when she shook my hand, she held it for a moment and looked at me and said that she was glad, at least, that one of them had come home. I thought about that for a long time afterward. The headstone in Riverside Cemetery was changed in April. The old one was removed and a new one was set in its place. It reads Paige Elizabeth Dunmore, with her correct dates, and a small carved lily at the base, which was my daughter's idea. She drove up for the ceremony, just the two of us and Gretchen and the minister. We stood in the April rain. Afterward, Gretchen thanked us and drove back to Virginia, and my daughter and I walked to Carol's grave next door and stood there in the rain without umbrellas because neither of us had thought to bring one. "She's been gone a long time, Lily," my daughter said, looking at Carol's stone. "I want to know her. I know I can't, but I want to." "I can tell you," I said. "I can tell you everything I know, if you want to hear it." She looked at me. Her eyes were wet, though whether from the rain or something else I couldn't say. "I do," she said. "I want to hear all of it." She officially filed to restore her birth name in May. She told me on the phone, not making a production of it, just mentioning it the way she might mention that the weather had changed. She said she thought she was ready to try it on properly. She said Lily was not gone. She had lived in that name and it had kept her safe, but she thought maybe she could hold both. She thought maybe she was both. She still signs her cards with both names. Lily Rebecca. I have 3 of them on my refrigerator now, held up with magnets she made for me from pieces of wood I gave her from the workshop. There is one more thing. We went fishing together in June on the Hiwassee River. which is about an hour south of Knoxville, and which she somehow asked about by name before I had mentioned it. She said she dreamed about a river, green water, and a flat rock in the middle she could wade out to. And when I pulled up a photograph on my phone, she pointed at the screen and said that was it, that was the rock. I had a photograph of her sitting on that exact rock at age 15, her feet in the water, the light coming through the rhododendrons. We drove out on a Saturday morning, just the two of us, with rods and a cooler and bad gas station coffee. The river was running clear and cold, and the mountains were green in every direction. She stood on the bank and held the rod and cast without hesitation, her whole body moving into it with the ease of something practiced and remembered, and the line went out clean and long over the water. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't entirely interpret, something between amazement and a sorrow that had no clean name. "My hands knew how to do that," she said, "even before I thought about it. You fished this river every summer from the time you were old enough to stand in the water without being swept over," I said. "Your mother taught you to cast. She was better at it than I was." She turned back to the river. The line floated on the current. Somewhere upstream a kingfisher shot past in a streak of blue. She hummed something, very soft, just under her breath without seeming to notice she was doing it. Not any particular song, just whatever was in her head. My throat closed. I turned away and looked at the water, and I stayed quiet, because some moments are not yours to speak into. Some moments belong entirely to the person who is having them, and all you can do is stand close enough to let them know they are not alone. We fished until mid-afternoon and didn't catch much worth keeping, and the drive home was easy and quiet in the way that only happens between people who have gotten comfortable with each other's silences. She moved back to Knoxville in September. Not into her old room, she wasn't ready for that, but into an apartment about 10 minutes from my house that she found and furnished herself. She brought her drafting table, and her paints, and her paper, and her lathe tools, which she was accumulating steadily. She set up a small studio in the second bedroom of the apartment, and she kept making her cards, and she kept seeing her therapist, and she came to my house on Sunday mornings for coffee. Sometimes she brought things for the workshop, and we'd work side by side without talking for an hour. Sometimes she'd sit at the kitchen table with her sketchbook while I cooked. The house was not quiet in the way it had been quiet for 9 years. It was a different kind of house now, occupied differently, by a father and a daughter who were learning each other from the beginning with the specific tenderness of people who know how suddenly and completely things can be taken away. I visit Carol's grave every Sunday, as I always have. Now sometimes she comes with me. We stand there together in whatever weather the week has sent, and I talk to Carol the way I always have, and I don't feel the need to explain it because Rebecca, Lily, my daughter, understands. She told me once that she thought her mother could probably hear me. I told her I thought so too. I was 63 years old when I walked past a craft fair booth on an October morning and saw a loop in a letter G that I had been staring at for 9 years. I am 64 now, and my daughter is alive and working in a studio apartment 10 minutes from my house, and she hums while she paints without knowing she's doing it. And last Sunday she brought a loaf of sourdough bread she'd made from a starter she'd kept alive for 2 years, and when I asked her if she'd always baked, she said she didn't know, she just did. People ask me if it's strange. They want to know if it's hard, loving a person who doesn't remember loving you back. I tell them the truth, which is that I don't experience it as something that needs to be survived. I experience it as what it is. It is extraordinary. Every ordinary Sunday morning of it is extraordinary. Every cup of coffee at the kitchen table, every afternoon in the workshop, every drive in the truck with the radio on and the mountains out the windows. It is all extraordinary because for 9 years none of it existed, and now it does. I was a man who visited a grave twice a week for 9 years, and talk to someone who wasn't there. I am now a man whose daughter calls on Tuesday evenings to tell me about her week, whose handwriting I recognize on every card on my refrigerator, whose footsteps I can hear on my porch stairs before she even knocks. That is not a small thing. That is the largest thing I know how to hold. She calls me Dad now, most of the time, not always. Some days still Robert. I have told her it does not matter, and I mean it. Both names in her voice are the same to me. Both names mean that she is here, and that I know it, and that on Sunday morning she will come up those porch stairs and through that door into the yellow kitchen where her mother used to hum, and her father still burns the toast more often than he should, and we will have coffee, and she will tell me what she's working on, and I will tell her about whatever is happening in the workshop, and we will be what we are, which is something we are still finding the right word for. There isn't one yet. Maybe there doesn't need to be. She's home. After 9 years of an impossible absence, she came back to a kitchen that still smells like coffee and sawdust and something older and quieter than both of those things. She came back to a house that waited for her without knowing it was waiting, and a father who kept the light on because he did not know what else to do with the dark. She's here. That's the whole story. That's the only ending I ever needed.